Hi, hello, and welcome to Rebel Unicorn Crafts. Today I want to talk about watercolor pencils because I've had these ones forever and I don't really use them because I don't like them. And after voicing this complaint, someone suggested I try the Holtz watercolor pencils. They're the distress ones. So I went ahead and purchased these for about $25. And it comes with 12 of these watercolor pencils. They're more like pigment sticks though, because the entire thing except for the little wrap is the pigment. So even though these are more pricey than the previous watercolor pencils, you get a ton more pigment in each one of these. Now, my actual problem with watercolor pencils wasn't necessarily the amount of pigment I was getting in the total pencil. It was more about how pigmented it was on the paper and then how much they didn't actually act like watercolor. You would scribble them down, add some water, and not much would happen. Yes, you could smooth them a little bit, but they just didn't act kind of how I had expected them to or wanted them to act. So we're going to kind of be doing a little comparison here. You can see I've swatched both of these and then added some water to them, and sure enough, the distress ones do move a little more like watercolor. It's still not hugely pigmented when you do wash it out, but you definitely get more of a wash of color than with the other watercolor pencils I had. Another little trick you can do with watercolor pencils is actually add some water to the nib to get a little bit more going, so let's scribble in that water place and see what happens. And doing that does make both of these more pigmented, but let's actually try another color. I tried to do similar colors in here. I don't have any exact matches, but I want to get a good idea of different types of colors because they typically have different properties even in normal watercolor themselves. Throwing down two similar-ish blues, and yeah, the distress ones seem to have a little more movement, but there is definitely less than the previous color on this one, so there's less of a change. Continuing on with this, I want to compare some of the other colors, so I tried to pick the colors that were the most similar from both of these packs, and I'm going to just kind of swatch these out. And even just from the little scribbles here, you can tell the distress ones are, in general, more pigmented than the other ones that I had. And when you add water to them, yes, they move more like watercolor. Some of these colors move more than the other ones do. The reds and yellows move really, really well in the distress ones, and in general they also move a little better than some of the other ones in the other set that I'm testing these against. And I just think that's because those red and yellow pigments kind of lead themselves to more of a watercolor type bleed in general. But after we let these swatches sit that have water on them for a minute, they actually, you can really tell that the distress ones are more like a normal watercolor. The entire little splotch that I have made wet kind of gets that little ring that's very similar to watercolor if you were to just make a blob of color. And more of that pigment actually comes out into the water than in general on the other ones. Now, one thing that I did kind of like watercolor pencils for, before deciding I just wanted to put these in a drawer and not really use them, was for actual gradients. Because you can take one of these colors and you can kind of start to use one color and get lighter and lighter as you go down, and then from the opposite direction do another color to make a nice little gradient. So we're going to try that on both of these. The fine touch ones, I was able to get a better drawing gradient, and part of that was because the edges of these were kind of a little more worn down, so I had a nice smooth surface to make a nice even gradient. And I haven't used the distress ones very much, so they still have more of a rounded tip on them, and I didn't try to kind of smooth anything out. But either way, the fine touch ones do look a little nicer when I just drew it. But once I actually add the water onto it, you can tell that it incorporates into a different color a little more. With the distress ones, you can really still see the pencil lines in the fine touch ones. This is a little short and sweet review of these and test. So I'm just going to do one more thing where I'm going to kind of make a two-toned petal flower, because I kind of want to see if you were to actually do something with these, how much they would move and how much more pigmented or potentially less pigmented they would be. One other thing I want to talk about, one of the qualms I had with just the normal watercolor pencils is that I found them to be very unsatisfying to use because they're really precise and scratchy, but like not in this really satisfying way. In general, when I'm working with something like watercolor pencils or watercolor markers, I want them to be a little more free-flowing, to add details and just kind of textural elements than what I do with a brush. And there's something about kind of the fatter edge and also the way that the distress ones glide onto the paper that gives me more of that feeling that I like rather than the watercolor pencils. If watercolor pencils are your thing, these distress ones seem to work pretty well, and they're kind of changing my mind on watercolor pencils. But I do want to keep in mind that the other set I have is a lower quality set, And so there might even be better ones out there, and so I'm kind of thinking that I mainly just got a bad first impression of watercolor pencils instead of them being bad in general. I do personally still prefer something like watercolor markers because I feel like they're more gestural, but I think that's just my personal preference. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about watercolor pencils? What brand do you use if you use them? And also, which of these two do you think perform better? I hope that you have a magically creative day.